All right, so just continuing our discussion from our previous lesson, talking about sensation and perception, we spent a lot of time discussing how vision works and how hearing works. And why is it? Why is it that we spend a lot of time focusing on vision and hearing in terms of taking the outside, getting that information from the outside and creating mental representations? Why is it we spend so much time focusing on vision and hearing?
Because we are trying to understand or process the information that we have in front of us.
Yeah, and a majority of our sensations come from those two senses, right? We get a lot of our outside information into us through our hearing and through our vision, mostly because those things can happen at a greater distance, right? So something could be happening miles away that we're able to see or even hear, for that matter, like lightning or something like that. And we don't necessarily, you think about all of our other senses, which is touch, smell, and taste. Those are pretty proximal senses. So everything has to happen within this small bubble that we're at, unless something is really really disgusting, something rotten in the trash and you can smell it throughout the house. But for the most part, everything happens within reach of us that we can see or that we can sense and through our touch, smell, and taste. But hearing and vision take on a good workload. And what happens when we lose one of those? It becomes a little bit more difficult to try and obtain information and evaluate our environment. So we might have to rely a little bit more, like, for example, if we lose our vision, we might have to rely on our hearing a little bit more, or our other senses, like for example, people that are visually impaired, that they might need to use a cane or something to walk around and sense the world around them so they don't fall into any holes or step off any cliffs or anything, right? So anyway, we tend to balance that with other senses that we do have, and those tend to be improved. Now, within your resources this week, make sure I have this in here. We have, oh, I don't actually have it in here for this week. Maybe it's next week. Daniel Kish, if anybody has ever heard of him, yeah, I don't see, maybe I didn't put it in I will put it in the resources for this week. So anyway, Daniel Kish was born blind. He was not able to see from birth. And his message was really, really inspiring, just about how we focus on what we can see. And when somebody encounters some kind of medical loss or adversity or something like that, we tend to act on that fear. We tend to act on that loss and kind of adopt a woe is me mentality, to the point where it's inhibiting. People are inhibited from any kind of progress if they can't get over whatever adversity is that they're enduring. So his message was, think outside the box. Think of other ways that I can survive and I can thrive in my environment. And he adapted to using echolocation, a series of clicks, to in fact still use his visual cortex. So his visual cortex isn't gone. It's still very much intact, and it's able to look at the space around him. So anyway, the point in that is just, even though we may lose one of our senses, we can still thrive. And his message is really good. And like I said, I will post that video so you can see it. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you so we can pick up where we left off. So 1 second here. Ooh, I almost ended the meeting for everybody. That would not have been good. It would have been a big, big mistake. All right. All right. So our focus today, just finishing up our senses, is chemical senses, and particularly looking at taste and smells. And then we're going to eventually get into touch. And we're not going to spend too much time in this area because it's pretty self-explanatory. Many of you have had this in high school and elementary school. So one of the ways that we, third way that we take in the world around us is through gustation or taste, okay? So gustation is the chemical response of whatever food or material that we're putting in our mouth, and if it has any kind of residue on it or anything that interacts with our receptor cells within our tongue, and that gives us a sense of what it is we're tasting. So why is that important, especially for survival purposes? Why do you think why do we have that? Why do we need to have a sense of taste, do you think?
Isn't like, didn't animals adapt through like the bitterness of what they tasted is like, it kind of relates to like a poison or just like not well?
Yeah. Well, there are two ways that taste is important to us. The first one is for nutrition, right? So certain things might have nutrition. Our body depends heavily on sodium. Okay, it's a vital process for us. So we have to be able to, one of our major senses with, or one of our major tastes with respect to taste, one of our, yeah, respective flavors in taste is salt, okay, because salt has sodium, and sodium is very necessary for vital functioning, such as we saw last week. Very implicated. It's very important for neurotransmitters, right? Making sure that those chemical reactions happen so that our brain neurons are firing, right? So sodium is one of them. So that would be one, is for nutrition, getting the necessary resources that we need, the fuel that we need to have our bodies survive and thrive. And then the other part is protection, such as poisons, being able to detect something poisonous. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever had any kind of food poisoning or food sickness?
I have.
Okay. We're going to revisit this, but think about, as we're going along with this, as to why we had those food poisonings and what happened afterwards, right? Because we tend to hold on to those tastes of something that might have harmed us in the past. Like if you got sick off of something and then ate something else, whatever those tastes, those combinations of tastes that you had prior, you almost hardwire into your memory to the point where you're not able to smell or even taste those things for a long time without, or ever for some people, without ever getting nauseous again. But that is by design. That's hardwired into our hippocampus so that we don't eat something that could potentially harm us. Okay, that's automatic protection, layer of protection for us. All right, so our 5 basic tastes. Again, this is probably a recap for some of you. Now, interestingly enough, I never had umami when I was going into elementary school and middle school. That was not a taste that was on this. So we had 4 senses at the time, which was salty, sour, bitter, and sweet. And then we have added umami, which is more of the proteins, which we also know proteins are necessary for us. But if you look at each one of these, every one of them has some kind of chemical necessity within our body. Like for example, sour might be vitamin C, might be indicative of citrus getting into us, which is necessary for certain for our immune system, right? Bitterness for pH balance, sweet for sugar, for glucose, umami for protein, and of course we talked about salt already, right? Let's see, I'm trying to think if there were any other things that I needed to talk about taste. So anyway, that was the big takeaway here, is just these have evolved. Now, what would happen, for example, if somebody was born or had some kind of injury that took away their sense of salt or maybe even sweet? Would that be hard for them to balance their own nutrition, to be able to tell whether what they're eating has? Like, for example, many of you might have a taste for something. For example, if your sugar is low, we tend to seek things that are sugary in nature, right? So things that have a little bit more sweetness to us. We have cravings, and that is by design. But one of the ways we can kind of a litmus test to make sure we're ingesting something is through our sense of taste. Okay. All right. Now we're going to talk about what, say again?
Would you consider taste an important sense when it comes on to the evolution and adapting? The part of it where we're talking about nurture nature versus nurture nature, in the senses that we're well, I'm not sure it is more important, or the ones that are used up mostly.
Okay. Well, let's kind of work backwards on this. I mean, what do you all think? What do you think? Is taste important for survival, for passing on that gene in terms of evolution? What do you think?
I never choose it as one.
Okay. Okay. Anybody think it is important for survival?
I do think it's important to survival.
Okay. Okay. What, in what capacity? Why do you think it's important for survival?
Because it helped us to like avoid bad food or something that can poison us.
Absolutely. Not only is it important for nutrition, right, to give us some kind of biological feedback as to what we're eating in terms of what we're craving and what our bodies are telling us that we need, but in terms of safety, right? We talked about that just a few minutes ago, is what happens if we don't have that safety mechanism, similar to pain. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But if somebody doesn't have that ability to taste something metallic, that like something is poisonous to them, right? The bitterness, right? That's a protection measure for us in some cases. So if we're in the practice of eating things that are bad for us, and we don't know that they're bad, and we have no way of memorizing what that taste was before, we're likely going to ingest that again, which could be very hazardous or very harmful for that individual. So as that being a trait that's passed down, that's why we see this trait in today, in our modern humans today, because they are indeed they somewhere in their ancestry, maybe it could be the caveman days, it could have been the Middle Ages or something like that. That characteristic, that feature was passed down to them, because if somebody didn't have that, the chances of them surviving were very highly unlikely. Okay. I've got a helicopter flying around here. All right. So did that answer your question, Shamika?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right. In terms of olfaction, or your sense of smell, also very, very important. Okay. Some of us, especially most recently with COVID, may have experienced a little bit of degradation in their olfactory senses. And I don't know if any of you have. I know I have. I had COVID here a couple months ago, and my sense of smell has not totally returned yet. It's not nearly as bad as it was. But anyway, very similar to taste, there is a chemical reaction. Anything that contains odors is usually some kind of particle of whatever that substance is that's being carried through the air. It attaches to air molecules, and when we breathe, of course, we breathe air. We're breathing in those food molecules or that substance, and that flows across our cilia in our olfactory reception site, which is right above our adenoids, right above our nose. And that, again, that helps us to, if you think back in the hunter and gathering days, helps us to identify food. Probably more advanced senses of smell back then were designed to probably detect animals, which could have either A, detected food, or B, detected threats. So that was important for survival back then as well. Today, not so much. You know, we don't really depend upon our nose for a sense of protection anymore. So we don't have it nearly as advanced as we did before. But we do know that we do have it, and it is still somewhat important for us to use to know when grandma is making those cookies, right? One thing I do want to kind of highlight with our olfactory senses is the proximity, the physical proximity. If you looked at our model of the brain in our previous lesson, you'll notice the proximity of the olfactory bulb, which is the processing center for the cilia hairs. The proximity to that is right near our hippocampus. And I mentioned that earlier, and this is really important to understand why. Because what happens when you have a familiar smell, something that is very, very familiar to you? I mentioned grandma's cooking her cookies or something like that, or maybe even mothballs. You know, I have kind of a mothball memory. But how many of you conjure up really strong emotions and memories when you smell something that's familiar? Anybody have any examples of that?
Because you connect that smell to the memory.
Yeah, you connect that smell to the memory. Does anybody have any examples of memories that they have when they smell something in particular?
Whenever I smell things like gasoline, I always think of my cabin when we were younger and the garage because it always smelled like that.
Okay, okay. And was that a positive memory for you?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else have any memories, either good or bad, that they care to share? I think I had mentioned mothballs before, right? So my great grandmother, she was a great cook too, and a really wonderful woman. A little Polish woman, and I'll tell you what, she had a lot of vigor. She lived to a nice ripe age of 102. So anyway, she loved going over to her house, but every time we went up to her, I loved exploring in her attic because she had all this cool stuff from early 1900s, 1800s, 1900s. I think she was born in 1890 at the time when she had passed. But anyway, so she had a lot of really, really cool stuff. And going up to her house and exploring those areas and smelling those mothballs really brought something, really infused something in my mind. So anytime I'm out and I smell lilacs, or which is very similar to what mothballs smell like, I think there might be a chemical that's in there, or scent that's in there. So anyway, that brings me back and kind of just gives me this feeling of belonging and takes me back to my childhood. So anyway, the reason that we do that through our sense of smell is, again, because our hippocampus, which is primarily responsible for long-term memory, is implicated in producing those memories and those emotions. And even when we look at food poisoning, that it resides in the hippocampus as well. So the proximity of our taste receptors and how they go through the brain is close proximity to the hippocampus, which again, that was probably by design to let us know where we don't have to go through kind of emotions to search for food, right? Now, if we smell something that we're hungry for, we're going to go right for that because that's hardwired into our long-term memory. Okay. All right. All right. So other senses that we have in our body. So one of the things that that I like to point out is that 4 of our senses are really they're localized, right? And what I mean by localized, so our sense of smell is pretty much our nose. Our sense of taste is our tongue. Our sense of hearing is our ears, and eyes, obviously, for vision. So our last sense is our semesthetic senses. So our semesthetic senses go throughout our entire body. They're not necessarily localized to one area. So for example, our skin sense, our pain and pressure and temperature, they go from our scalp to our little toe, so they're just spread throughout our body. And the same way with our kinesthetic sense. And I used to do this with my live classes with this class, with Psych 101. But what we can usually see with our kinesthetic sense is being able to, maybe some of you can try this now, is close your eyes and hold your finger, your pointer finger out towards each other, put your arms way out in front of you and close your eyes, and then try and connect your fingers without looking. That's our kinesthetic sense. And that is this constant biofeedback loop that's going through our limbs and going through our sense of touch to kind of give us an idea of where our limbs are through space, through whatever space we have around us. And then we have our vestibular sense, which is our third type of sense of touch, which tells us where our body is in reference to gravity or some kind of movement, right? And that's usually within our ear system that tells us, like kind of a gyroscope, the fluid that's spinning around in there gives us a sense of where we are in position. Okay. All right, so just a little brief little look at the skin and all of its receptors, and hopefully maybe, I know this print is very, very small, but if you look at look at a cross section of our skin. Now, our skin is, millimeter, it's not even that thick at some spots, but within that we have all these things going on. We have this we have all these pain receptors, we have the blood vessels towards the bottom, we have the hair follicles towards the top, and then the protective skin surface on top of that. So underneath each of those layers, in between each of those layers, we have different receptors that tell us different things. In certain areas of the body, they might be a little bit more concentrated than others. So for example, our pressure sensitive nerves just tell us, like, if there's something that is even close to us. They're not really painful, but it's just alerting our brain that there is something around us, that there's something that's possibly touching us. So we can be a little bit more prepared. Either we are expecting it to or not expecting it to. And then below that, we start seeing different types of receptors, such as pain sensitive and touch and shock sensors that let us know when something is hitting our skin a little deeper, hitting a little harder. And again, maybe just one of those receptors alone isn't enough to really cause any kind of reactionary pain or anything like that, reactionary senses, but it does let us know that something has happened. So the more of those receptors that are touched, the greater response we're going to likely have. And if you remember, when we're talking about neurons, they don't vary in the degree or the degree to which they fire. Okay. So for example, if you have a neuron that's firing from a pain receptor, it's not going to fire bigger. It's not going to have a higher amplitude based on how much that pain receptor is being activated. Okay. But more pain receptors being activated is going to send more alarms to our brain telling us, hey, instead of being a 1 alarm fire here, we've got a 5 alarm fire going on. Something is hurting us and we need to investigate, or we need to move away through our reflexes. Okay. Pain gate theory is just basically pain signals that pass through a gate located in the spinal cord. And this is kind of a super highway. So throughout our entire body, we have these pain gates that that just control the signals that go up to our brain. Now that is mitigated by many, many things. Now we were talking, getting ahead of myself. We were talking last week about neurotransmitters and things such as endorphins, right? Especially in terms of adrenaline. When adrenaline kicks in, it acts as a pain receptor, or I'm sorry, a pain inhibitor. So similar to what morphine would be. So if we have other senses activated within our body, those pain receptors are going to be dampened. And this happens through the process that we call gate control theory. All right. And then our last, oh no, I'm sorry, not our last. Our last two is kinesthetic sense and vestibular senses. And these are our sense of movement, where our body is in location to itself. And if you think about the importance of that, that's a relatively important thing that we need to know, because if we're running, we need to know exactly where our foot is so that we can swing it around and put it to where it needs to be. Okay, so that's the important of that, is just movement and being and honing in on our fine motor skills. Our vestibular senses are sensations of movement and balance, like we talked about earlier. Now, why is that important? Why is it we need to know where our body position is? Why do you think? Why is it we need to know what's up, what's, if we're spinning, why is that important?
Because I have an example. If you are like in a stairs and you are like going to the second floor, if you don't have the ability, then you won't like remember which leg is the next one. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
Okay. So are you talking about kinesthetic sense? Like
yes.
which yeah, okay. So which leg is which, right? Being able to control that and get that sense back to your brain so you can make movements appropriate. But and then vestibular senses is our sense of balance. Okay. Why is balance important? Because we have our kinesthetic sense, which tells us which body part we need to move in order to maybe keep balance. But why do we need that sense of balance? Why is that important for humans?
We wouldn't be able to carry out daily activities.
Right. How do we know how we're moving or how fast we're moving, or if we're spinning for that matter? Now, I remember as a kid, we used to spin around in chairs until our vestibular senses were all catawampus and you'd try and stand up and fall to the floor. In fact, I think you see that on any baseball fans. They do that in the seventh inning stretch. They have people come out and see if they can win a race after twirling around a baseball bat for, I think it's 20 times or something like that. So that's what we're talking about, your vestibular senses. It is, and if it's impacted, it could cause some pretty significant things such as dizziness, falling over. Anybody that has motion sickness has a mismanagement. There's a mismanagement between what they're seeing and what their vestibular senses are telling them, which induces almost a fear response to us to the point where people get sick. So that's where that sickness comes from, is a mismanagement or miscommunication between our visual senses or other senses and our vestibular sense.
So what about of people that get sick when they are like in a car?
Well, that's car sickness. That's motion sickness. That what's happening is what they're seeing in front of them is not registering within their balance, within their vestibular senses. So the fluids that are swirling around behind your ear are being detected. Okay, that's giving you a sense of motion. If they're not being detected, or if it's not swirling like it should be, and you're seeing movement, then that's telling your body that there's something wrong there. And for some reason, our natural response to that is to purge the contents of our stomach. And that just might be in preparation for, not being able to flee or something like that. I'm not exactly sure why that occurs, but that is the natural response, is to either get dizzy, hyperventilate, have some kind of fear response, or purge the contents of your stomach. So that's what happens with motion sickness, is your vestibular senses and your visual are not aligned properly. Okay, what you're seeing is not what you're feeling, in other words. All right, so moving on to perception. So again, just to kind of delineate the two of them, sensation is how we take the information in from the outside into our senses, and then those senses go to our processing center, our central nervous center, or our brain. After they get to our brain, we have this thing that we call a mental process that occurs. So we get it in there, we have to make sense of it because it's just raw data, right? It's just information that we don't even know what it means until we assign meaning to that. And we draw upon that meaning in several different ways. We use our humanistic way of dealing with it, which might be to put it into some kind of categorization or classification that we can just have it as an ease of use, or we're going to draw upon our past experiences to either memorize or process or do something with that information so that we can act accordingly. So that mental process is called perception. and your book identifies that as the method by which sensations are organized and interpreted. That's the big one I want you to highlight here, is how it's interpreted, because it really doesn't necessarily matter if the raw information is coming in, and if it doesn't mean anything to you, then it doesn't mean anything to you. I like to use the example of a siren. You know, if we hear certain sirens out, you know, I mean, pretty much anywhere in the world, you know what a siren is, because it denotes some kind of emergency vehicle, right? But can you imagine if you were an alien, like you just were dropped off on the planet Earth and you never heard a siren before in your life, okay? And all of a sudden you hear this blaring thing in the background, and it's getting closer, and it's getting closer, and it's getting closer. You're going to interpret that very differently than somebody that has had that experience before. And that happens with this process that we call perception, all right? So within our perception, we have things that, especially with vision, we look at size constancy, we look at shape constancy, and we look at brightness constancy. And I have a couple things to kind of show you, to highlight or to demonstrate some of these principles. But these principles are based, on gestalt principles. So gestalt basically coined the idea. I'm not going to go too much in the history of of what gestalt is and where it came from, but what it has to do with, short and sweet, is our tendency to make sense of the world around us through patterns. Okay, so what that means is we see things that necessarily aren't there, but because we have familiarity with that, and again, this is just in our attempt to make things a little bit more sensible within our world around us, make sense of the world around us. So anyway, gestalt principles are principles that are based on the idea that people have a natural tendency to force patterns into whatever they see. And I know that doesn't sound like it means very much, but like I said, when we get into some of these examples here, you'll see what I mean. One of the gestalt principles we have is figure ground. And basically what this is stating is that we are able to understand gravity, okay? We know how gravity works. We know that those trees are branching out, they're defying gravity, that water is coming down. Looking at this picture, we get a good sense, even if it was upside down, we would get a good sense at where top and bottom is of this picture, okay? So also within that, we understand that things that, like that rock is covering up that tree, for example, okay? So since we can see what we know, what we recognize as that large rock, and we know what a tree looks like, we can assume that that rock is in front of that tree. So there's a lot of things that with physics that occur here, and we could have never taken a physics class in our lives, or that maybe we haven't even taken a geology class to know what a rock looks like, but we know what a rock looks like because we have that experience, okay? We know what a tree looks like. We know what a waterfall looks like. We know what the sky looks like, right? We can assume that blue and white is the cloud and sky in the background. So that's what figure ground is described in Gestalt principles. Also within Gestalt principles, we have a concept called proximity. So that means that within each one of these proximities, we look at closeness. We look at patterns in how things are arranged. In this case, we see a cube, right? We're looking at a 4x4 cube. And if you know anything about math, you know there are 16 dots within that cube. However, if we spread that out, that no longer looks like a cube to us, right? So if we look at the grouping here, what will we say? And that cube turns into what when we look at this differently?
Rectangle.
Oh, what's that? One more time.
Rectangle.
Yeah, rectangle, or maybe even 4 lines, right? So we look at them as 4 lines because they're spread out. Oops. So close to proximity, we also have similarity. Now, similarity is making patterns out of things that look alike in some way. They might have different characteristics of them. In this case, what if we turn a section of these green, right? Now we have 2 sets of lines one set of blue and one set of green lines that are intertwined, right? But we are looking at that as a grouping now, okay? Many of you probably would look at that pattern first and see the green lining up as opposed to looking at them as alternating. You have a blue, green, blue, green, blue, green, blue, green. You know, most people don't look that way. But to most people, yeah, you look at these as similarities and you group those together as such. Okay, closure. This happens more than you might think. Now, the example here that we have is looking at, we have these kind of Pac-Man, these blue little Pac-Man, if you know what Pac-Man is, figures, 3 of them, right? And they have a chunk of pie missing from each one of them. And then we also have our these, I guess, 3 little angles that are shown in the background there. What do you actually see within that?
I see a white triangle in the middle.
You see a white triangle in the middle, right? Even though the rest of this background is white and there are no defining boundaries, our natural tendency is to draw upon our experience and see something that's not actually there. And that's important, right? Because again, we want to find patterns and things. We want to make sure that we can see what we need to see, and sometimes that could be for survival reasons. But that happens more than you think. You might see, let's see if we got, what can you see in this picture here? This is a good example of closure.
A ball.
A ball. Okay. Now, if you were from a foreign planet and never seen a soccer ball in your life, how would you even know what that is?
Nope.
Probably not. Now, looking at this, if you stare at it long enough, you can probably get a sense that there is a circle enclosure around it. But you know, again, there's no defining boundaries to really show that to you. But with our experience, many of us as kids, we've seen soccer balls or volleyballs or something like that. So we get a sense that this is indeed a ball. So we are drawing upon our need to identify patterns, and we're drawing upon our experiences to do so within closure. So here's another one. You know, these are just a series of circles that our mind is telling us, well, hey, you know, we need to kind of put this together and make sense of it. This is our natural tendency to make sense. So what do you see within that pattern?
A box.
A cube, right? You see a cube in there, right? All right. So those are just some examples of closure. Another principle of gestalt would be continuity, looking at things that again, drawn upon experience that makes sense to us. One of the examples I like to use here are the cross beams, the cross lines here. So these are just a series of dots. So what if you had to trace maybe from left to right, or our tendency would be to look at continuity in this, and we would see that going left to right, quite possibly, is we start up at the top and it kind of arches down to the middle and then ends at the bottom, right? That's our sense of continuity, because that makes the most sense for us. It's linear. It's not any kind of drastic change, but as opposed to that, go back to it. Some people, or most people, would see that this way. It's easier to see it that way than to look at the starting at the top left and going down to the middle and then bending to the bottom left to the screen. Most people would not see that kind of pattern. They would see continuity. They would see something going in a straight line. Okay. And we do that again to make sense. Contiguity, however, is an event that, events that happen in sequence for each other, right? So again, this is just our way of trying to make sense of the world around us. And if we look at For example, if I'm on my way to work today, I saw a squirrel lying in the road. That would probably be event number 2, right? What happened at event number 1? Now I start asking these questions, and likely he got hit by a car or fell out of a tree, and whatever. But seeing the result of something lets us know that maybe we need to find out what happened to that. Now, why would that be important for us? Why do we, if we see something that might be as alarming as a dead animal, why would we be in such an interest in that? What do you think?
Can you repeat the question?
So if we see like something as such as a dead animal, why do we pay attention to that? Why is it important for us to surmise or come up in our brains why, what happened to that animal? Why is event number 1 important to us if we see the aftermath?
So if we see a dead body, in this case, an animal dead body, we're gonna start thinking that there's danger around us.
Right. There's danger, right? There's something out there that is killing squirrels. Now, our experience tells us that this is pretty common with squirrels, right? They're not the brightest animals on the planet. They tend to run out in the road, and they get all confused until the car hits them in the head and they roll. Sorry, I know I'm getting a little graphic, but that's what happens. And we've seen it. We've seen the aftermath of it. So we kind of just dismiss it anymore. But again, if you were an alien coming down from Mars or Venus or wherever there might be life, and you see a dead animal on the road, you better believe that we're going to be looking on that and saying, well, we know death is a result of something, so we're going to look at event number 2. So again, that's hardwired into us to try and determine what is happening. And these are just some examples. Hopefully you can see that. I know many of you are looking on your phone, but just to demonstrate proximity, the nearness of each other, looking at them as a whole or spread out, whatever. Similarity, detecting patterns, like instead of seeing 2 red, 2 black, 2 red, 2 red, or whatever, you're seeing boxes. You're seeing red boxes, blue boxes, red boxes, blue boxes. Closure, again, just using the available information to make a differentiation. And continuity, we talked about, and then common region is just an expansion on similarities. Okay. All right. What I like to do with this is, and this is something that many of you probably look at each day, and you're not even aware of it. But when we look into websites, we like websites to be aesthetically pleasing, right? We like them to make sense to us, because if they don't make sense to us, what do we tend to do? We move off of that site, or we don't bookmark it, or we'll never go back to it because it's very confusing. I can remember several instances. In fact, I had a product that I was buying just last week, and this kind of came up for me. And I went into, there are 2 companies that sell the site or sell this product. And I went into one of the sites, and it was just in disarray. I mean, there wasn't very much information. There was information about it. In fact, it was the same information that was on the other site that I bought it. But I went into the site initially, and it didn't make a lot of sense. The menu was all over the place. It wasn't easy to find their contact information if something went wrong. So I chose to purchase that product on another site because of how disorganized the other site was. But you look at that as an example, if you're looking at news or weather or something like that. And they have psychologists and they have graphic designers that help to design these things to make it a little bit more pleasing for you. But looking at proximity off to the left-hand side, you have the menu, because that's usually where menus are. So you click on the left and it expands something to the right. That's usually what happens. So proximity and similarity, as you can see, the different categories here, you got England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, business, politics. These are all your major topics. And then below that, you're going to have kind of the lesser pick topics. So have yours say week at a glance, country profiles, so on and so forth. And then over on the right-hand side, you have like this really big picture, right? So that kind of tells you this is probably the biggest news that we have on here today. And that gives you a sense of, well, maybe I should check that out. And it's got all these pictures that tell you, you know, what's going on. It gives you a visual depiction of what's happening as well as a verbal one. And then continuation, yeah, you can see that gray bar along the bottom. You know, that separates the top news articles from things that just, you know, Q&A, Dr. Seuss, you know, these probably aren't nearly as important. And then you have similarity at the bottom there. As you can see, they're separated by different regions of the world or different continents. Okay. All right, within depth perception, this gives us our ability to use our eyes to predict or assess how far something is around us. So you remember figure ground, right? Looking at figure ground, we know that something that is large compared to something that is small, if it's the exact same item, we know that there's probably going to be one of those is closer than the other. So depth perception is a little bit different because what it's doing is it's taking two different visions, two different pictures of what we're looking at, and it's comparing them. And based on how different they are, we can tell how close that item is, or that object is. Okay. And some people have difficulty with depth perception, which might make it very difficult to, per se, ride a bike, or even in some severe cases, even drive a car. If you can't tell how far an object is off in your distance, or whether it's approaching or departing, then that could wind up in some pretty bad disasters for that individual, right? So anyway, our depth perception helps us with the ability to look at the world in 3 dimensions. And we can do that in either monocular or binocular ways. Okay. Monocular, meaning mono or one, just looks at depth as it is perceived based on what we talked about earlier about how what we know would be equivalent sizes. Like we know that people are pretty much all alike. They are about the same size. They have a head, they have a torso, they have legs. And roughly, you know, if we see 2 adults, one is bigger, much bigger than the other, we would probably assume through monocular cues that that individual is closer to us, not using any kind of depth perception with 2 eyes. Okay, we're just using it based on comparison of what's around them. Through monocular, we look at interposition, what we talked about earlier. Okay, very similar to gestalt. We know what a tree looks like. We know what a rock looks like. That rock looks whole, that tree does not. Therefore, we can assume that that tree is behind that rock. Okay. We have the linear perspective. Many of you, when you started out, maybe in early art classes or something like that, you did something very similar where you were drawing something off in the distance. We know that looking at 2 tracks, and as things get smaller, you know, they might be off a little bit further off in the distance, and as tracks converge, we can say that that they're heading off towards the horizon. Okay, so using the horizon and using other visual cues to let us know that something is going off into the distance or coming towards us. Relative size, what we talked about. So we know what a person looks like. The smaller they get, the likelier it is that they're running off on they're off farther away from us. Okay, and we also have linear perspective in here too. How is that? How are we seeing linear perspective, do you think? Any guesses? Anybody see any linear perspective in here?
On the floor?
On the ground, right? So our assumption is that each one of those people are equal size or close in size, and that they're running on a similar track. You know, we're detecting that we've got a little bit of gestalt principles going here too, because we're making sense that each one of them is probably on a very similar track, and they're getting smaller. So it's pushing that off into the distance in our monocular cues. Okay. Texture gradient. We know that things tend to be a little bit more finer detailed the closer they are to us, as opposed to looking at the rocks further away from us, less detail. We don't see those granite spackling throughout, right? It all looks just kind of gray and a little bit blurry the further and further it goes. So looking at texture gradient, and then aerial perspective. So again, kind of using the same principle or similar principle where we have details here, but looking in the background, we see more of a haze. We associate haze with being something being further in the distance, right? Motion parallax, okay? Things when we're in motion, when we're moving, things that go across our field of view a little quicker are probably closer. So as you can see, some of the trees, like especially that mountain is pretty far off in the distance, right? So that's not moving very fast at all. However, you saw the animals a little earlier on, they zip by that window. So you know that they're probably a little bit closer. So those are just some ways, some principles that we look at when we're trying to gauge how close something is. And our mind does this automatically. Our mind shifts things to a point where it can actually play tricks on our mind. And some of the things that you're going to be doing for your assignments, let me bring this up. For your assignments are going to be very similar to this. So I'm going to share my screen so you can all see what I'm doing. So as I said before, we kind of adapt to physics without even thinking about it, right? Our bodies and our minds are just wired that way from birth. We start figuring things out earlier on. One example of that is looking at this cube. We know that light comes from where?
On top.
Above.
Right from above us, right? And we're using some other cues here to tell us exactly what's happening. Now, you're not using your binocular view to look at this item here. What you're using is you're using visual cues. So if you look at these little squares that are beneath us or that are in front of us, the black and white the floor of this or the table of this, the surface, they're getting smaller as it goes off in the distance. That's our linear perspective. We have a shadow here, right? So our shadow is indicating to us that that something is shining on this. So we have two tiles here, and hopefully maybe you can zoom in to look at these, but we have tile A, tile B, and tile C. Which one of those would you say is close to matching tile C, A or B in color?
A.
A? Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, A.
A, okay, all right. Anybody think B? Okay, probably not, okay? Again, our mind is telling us that light is coming from above, so it is actually shifting the color of B in our mind to make it look, what, lighter or darker than C?
Lighter.
So what happens if I remove those contexts? What happens if I get rid of those cues?
Then it looks like the same color. There's less light.
So, and that's your mind bending the reality of this. So it looks like it's lighter because our mind is telling us that that's in the shadow. So if it was an equal color, then it would be even darker than C, right? But indeed, it's actually the same color. There's no trickery here. I'm not using anything to change that, but
Am I the only one that's seeing brown?
yeah, well, it turns so it turns. I'm taking away the contextual cues around it, right? Do you see that? Is that showing up on you? I'm moving that. I'm able to block
Yeah,
that.
I'm seeing it, but it looks brown.
Yeah, it looks
Not the
brown
same
now.
color,
What does it look now when I remove that?
yellow.
Looks like an orangish yellow or something like that, right? Let's try another one. Okay. Again, using those same principles, we're kind of looking at this as a 3D image. What would you say is darker, A or B?
A.
A looks darker, right? Let's see what happens when I take away the contextual clues. They're equal. Hopefully that's shown up on your end, but they look exactly the same. Yeah, because what's happening again, our mind is telling us that light is coming from above based on the shadows, based on the linear perspective. Light is shining on that, so therefore it must be darker on the top and almost lighter or white on the bottom, right? But you take away those contextual clues.
You're not changing the picture or not.
I am
Anything,
not
are you?
changing the picture at all. Nope. This is no trickery. This is the only thing I'm doing is taking away the environment so that you can kind of see how your mind is playing tricks on you. It's doing that to make sense of the world around you. It does that automatically. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Let's see what else I have. So within here, you know, I had a bunch of other ones I want to do. Maybe I'll get into these a little bit later. Actually, let me run through these so we can pick up where we left off on Monday. So binocular cues, a little bit different than, I mean, we do use monocular cues. We use monocular cues to give us that linear perspective. But binocular cues are just a little bit different. We use a system of convergence and binocular disparity. And all that means, so convergence is our eyeballs movement, okay? Looking at something from different angles. So for example, if our eyes get crossed, we know that something is probably right up in our face, or it's right up really close to us. So using the position of our eyes and how uncomfortable it is to kind of cross them in order to look at something that's a little closer, we call that convergence. And then binocular disparity is how different does that look from different angles. And we use binocular disparity quite frequently. Does anybody have like an Oculus or 3D, what do they call them? Virtual reality, VR headsets? Has anybody ever used one of those or seen one of those?
I use one.
They're using binocular disparity. They're using a combination of different shades and colors and giving you something in each eye to make it look like they are simulating that something is physically in front of you or farther away from you. So that's the science behind visual disparity. Within depth perception, you know, we can alter depth perception by a sequence of squares and again, other contextual clues, because we're assuming that if we were looking at the surface, these would all be squares, rectangles, white or black rectangles. So we get the impression that this is some kind of curvature going around some kind of center column. Okay. I'm going to go into that a little bit later. So these are some things that play on your retina. So if you look at this, for any of you, does this look like this wheel is moving when you stare at the center?
Yes.
So what that's doing, that's playing on your cones and your rods, and they're bleeding into each other, and it's giving us a sense that there is movement going in one direction or the other based on the white and the black versus the color that's happening. So our eyes are almost twisting to kind of compensate for those mix of colors in there. And of course, here's another example of this. These aren't moving at all. This is actually a still picture, but based on the color cues that are here. And these are just some ideas. If any of you have any other ones you want, you can use them for your assignment. Okay. All right. So any question on the topics we covered today? I know I kind of rushed it. It's a lot of information. You know, 2 days is not a whole lot of time for us to cover entire chapters. You know, I try and pick and choose some of the finer points in there and talk about. But yeah, starting next week, we'll get into a few more group activities and things that might make a little bit more sense and give you some practice with some of these topics. Okay. Any questions before we depart today?